time for Global Insight, where we speak to experts from around the world on issues making headlines. Now, South Korean President Yoon and US President Joe Biden wrapped up their first bilateral summit together less than 2 weeks after Yoon took office. After holding talks that stretched well over the expected 90 minutes initially set for the two leaders, they emerged with a joint statement affirming stronger commitment to their traditional security ties as well as economic security. Now, today we unpack the highlights of their talks, and for this we're joined by J. James Kim, Director of the Center for Regional Studies at Asan Institute for Policy Studies, and Dr. Kim Sei-wan, Professor of Economics at Ewha Women's University. Thank you both so much for joining us. And my first question to you, Dr. James Kim. Now, strengthening extended deterrence, that was one large portion of the leaders' joint statement, obviously, and it mentioned moving US strategic assets to South Korea and also the possibility of expanding joint military drills. So what do you think these things really tell us about the level of threat that the allies are perceiving from North Korea?
Hi, Xiang. I think both South Korea and the US want to send a stern signal that it's no more anything goes for North Korea. So the leaders wanted to show that they are enhancing readiness and deterrence. And so the signal that they're sending is that they're serious about any kind of provocation from North Korea.
And Dr. James, what do you think really the reaction from North Korea is going to be? And China as well, because obviously they're very wary about the sort of security alliance that Seoul and Washington has.
Yeah, we can be concerned a bit about that, but there's nothing really new here from the point of view of North Korea or China, because our understanding of extended deterrence, it suggests that all options are on the table when it comes to the type of responses. And even, on things like rotational allocation of strategic assets. So, I think that there's really nothing new here for Pyongyang or China to get concerned about. But rightfully, I think we should be watching for any kind of responses if there are any.
Professor Kim Sei-wan, now, economic security, that was another large portion of the two leaders' joint statement, and it took up a lot of their talks. And well, while most countries weren't too enthusiastic about the Indo-Pacific economic framework that South Korea pledged to join, what are the key reasons that Seoul is so enthusiastic about it?
Yes, new Korean government has recognized that participating in the Pacific economic framework is crucial in maintaining Korean economic's leadership in key industries like semiconductor, battery, automobile, and so on. Particularly to Korean economy, next several years are extremely important in staying at the frontiers of high-tech industries. Basically, this is why Korean government became active in the Pacific economic framework. But the CPTPP is actually led by Japanese government, and US government is not much into CPTPP. Even though US government walked out of TPP in Trump administration in 2017, they decided not to go back to CPTPP in Biden administration. US government wants to construct its own economic binding through Indo-Pacific economic framework.
And Dr. James Kim, well, many experts believe that perhaps the US doesn't have a clear strategy, an economic strategy for the Indo-Pacific region right now, and the response from Indo-Pacific countries towards IPEF has been rather lukewarm. So why do you think Seoul is so enthusiastic about this framework?
I think the key here is that IPEF is still in the formulative stage of its conception, and that and different countries are kind of waiting to hear what this agreement really is about. Having said that, I think that South Korea, it's prudent for South Korea to take part in this process of shaping the agenda for IPEF. If you recall, South Korea could not take part in shaping the CPTPP because it elected not to get involved early on. And so, when it comes to IPEF, we know that the United States very much is in the leadership position, along with other like-minded countries like Japan and others. But it will shape it will be the agreement or a framework that will set the standards for economic relations with these countries in the 21st century. And as I've said before, it's just prudent for the leadership in South Korea to get involved early on in this process rather than elect to not be involved when we all know that it will impact South Korea's national interest.
Professor Kim Sei-wan, now some were hoping that perhaps showing support for IPEF and also America's push to forge a semiconductor alliance might get some export curbs or export controls removed, the US having some steel quotas for South Korean businesses. Do you think that would be possible, and why has President Biden been reluctant to remove them from South Korean companies when tariffs on Europe and Japan were eased for the most part?
I believe that U.S. government will lift the tariffs on Korean steel products sooner or later. Actually, over the last week's Korea-U.S. summit meeting, there was a high expectation that U.S. will take some forward-looking gesture on this matter. As of now, there's no reason for U.S. government to continue to impose tariffs on Korean steel products after ending tariffs on U.S., EU, and Japan steel products. When U.S. government is negotiating over steel tariffs with EU and Japan last year, I think there were some political considerations on Korean case. Like U.S. government wanted to hold a leverage to induce more cooperation from previous Korean government.
And Dr. James Kim, now the two leaders agreed that extended deterrence would also cover conventional threats, and they also pledged to revive the consultation group on extended deterrence. So what do these developments really indicate?
Well, it simply means that the concept of extended deterrence covers a broad range of threats posed by potential adversaries in the region. And that South Korea and the United States are jointly willing and able to respond to all of these threats. So it's a confirmation of the key principles underlying the concept of extended deterrence. And what both countries are saying is that we're willing to respond to any threats, not just nuclear ones. And I think it's meaningful in that regard in sending a really important signal to potential adversaries who may be a threat to South Korea.
And Professor Kim Sei-wan, now, do you think that IPEF is perhaps at this stage a more political platform, or do you think we are going to see more details on Monday when there's an announcement? Do you think it would actually take form as a multilateral institution or a trade pact?
As you said, U.S. President Biden is expected to officially announce the beginning of IPEF in Tokyo this week. In the structure of the IPEF, the relation between political purpose and economic purpose is mutually complementary, which means each purpose is helping the other. U.S. wants to constrain the big rise of China through building up a global production chain in high-tech industries with its allies. This is the real purpose of the IPEF. So Korean government believes that IPEF can accelerate Korean economy's development in high-tech industries in the future.
And Dr. James Kim, now President Biden is in Japan, of course, and he'll be meeting with the Japanese leader Fumio Kishida on Monday. And well, after that, what do you think will come next? How do you see South Korea and the US really strengthening their trilateral cooperation with Japan?
I think we'll hear more about trilateral cooperation in the months to come, but I don't think we should have an overly high expectations to see immediate changes. And that's because South Korea and Japan have elections that are scheduled in the next 2 months. And neither country would be willing to take chances ahead of those elections. But look for possible expansion of the scope and scale of joint exercises in the region, or through U.S.-led security initiatives like unpack. We may also see more diplomatic engagement trilaterally in the weeks ahead.
And your views on this, Professor Kim Sei-wan, what do you think will be the next steps in terms of the trilateral alliance going forward?
I pretty much agree with Dr. Kim's views on this matter. And in addition, I would say in the past, the economic relation with Japan has been dominated by political issues. As we have seen in the case of Abe administration's export banning key materials in semiconductor production in 2019, Korea and Japan go through unnecessary conflicts. But compared to previous government, the new government takes more positive gesture to Japan. Between Korea and Japan, there are lots of economic opportunities to share together in global market. For example, in the semiconductor industry, Korea and Japan are great partners already. Japan provides high-tech key materials, and Korea's semiconductor manufacturers produce finished product of semiconductor. The two countries can expand this kind of economic relationship further in other industries.
And Dr. James Kim, now wrapping up the summit, we had a rather unorthodox summit compared to previous South Korea-U.S. summits. And a U.S. leader really flying over first to meet a new South Korean president, that's been quite rare. It's not been seen in over 2 decades. And we also saw scenes of President Biden greeting Samsung leader Lee Jae-yong, who welcomed him to the company's chip factory, also speaking in English as well. So all these things, how do you think it really set the tone for the next few years in South Korea-U.S. relations? Do you think they're going to perhaps enjoy closer ties now?
Yeah, and not to mention, 11 days after inauguration of President Yoon, President Biden makes this trip towards Asia, and his first stop happens to be Korea. So there are many meaningful things about this first meeting. I think it's fairly clear. There's an air of optimism for both Korea and the United States. There appeared to be good chemistry between the two men, and the joint statement showed that there was progress from the last summit, in that it included details which were not in the last joint statement. We talked about some of that, like IPEF and EDSCG. It also showed that both Biden and Yoon saw eye to eye on the notion of deepening and broadening comprehensive and strategic nature of the alliance by looking beyond the peninsula-related issues to begin addressing more global and regional issues together. I thought it was meaningful that the joint statement also touched on basic values like human rights and freedom, which wasn't emphasized as much in the Moon administration. And finally, as you mentioned, the fact that both Samsung and Hyundai signaled a willingness to step up to the plate and contribute towards these ends also showed that there was more corporate muscle behind the effort led by the two governments. I think overall, this is a really good start for President Yoon.
And Dr. James Kim, just another question to you. How do you think China would be perceiving all of this? Because there were some concerns that a closer step towards the US economically, diplomatically, or security-wise, it was going to offend it no matter what. But especially with the IPEF launch coming on Monday, how do you think China is going to really respond to this?
Well, President Yoon, when he was running in the election, had a platform on China policy, which suggested that he was willing to move with the principle of mutual respect. I think the Chinese signaled a willingness to work with South Korea. I think Wang Qishan mentioned that during his visit inauguration. Foreign Minister Wang Yi reiterated that right after inauguration. If the Chinese are interested in engaging with South Korea, they should do so in a more positive way. And I think that that's what President Yoon is looking for. In many ways, I think that the principle of mutual respect requires that. So this is a really good test for Beijing. They need to follow through with what they proposed at inauguration. If we see a more confrontational approach, I think it will end up backfiring, not only in the form of non-cooperation from the leadership in Seoul, but also, the public sentiment for China has really turned negative, and I fear that it may even get worse.
And before we go, Professor Kim Sei-wan, my final question to you. Well, in terms of economic security, which was highlighted very much during the two leaders' joint press conference, the actually four areas, semiconductors, batteries and key materials, as well as nuclear energy, these were highlighted as important sectors for both countries. So in terms of moving this relationship or these commitments forward, what do you expect to be the next few steps?
Well, to Korean economy, it is very important to participate in the frontier of the high-tech industry. We know that semiconductors, batteries, and automobiles are supporting Korean economy in a great scale. So for maintaining this kind of global competitiveness in more advanced industries like artificial intelligence and IoTs and so on, it is important to have a technology share with United States. Otherwise, it is very, very difficult to develop these industries without U.S. support. So I think it was a right choice to join the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework to further development of the Korean economy.
I see. And well, I'm afraid with time, this is where we'll have to end the interview today. That was J. James Kim, Director of the Center for Regional Studies at Asan Institute for Policy Studies, and Kim Sei-wan, Professor of Economics at Ewha Women's University. Thank you both so much for your time today.
Thank you for having me.